The clinking of wine glasses echoed through the golden-lit dining hall of Cipriani's, one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. Tonight, every table was filled with men in tailored suits and women in gowns worth more than most people's rent for a year. It was a place where power was paraded as casually as a new wristwatch. Among them sat Victor Callahan, a billionaire CEO who thrived in rooms like this. His booming voice carried across the space, drawing eyes, commanding attention. Every laugh at his table came not because his jokes were funny, but because people needed his favor. Just a few steps away, Amani Brooks, a young black waitress, carried a silver tray balanced effortlessly on one hand. Her apron was neatly pressed, her bun tight, her steps precise. To the powerful in the room, she was nearly invisible, just a shadow slipping in and out to refill glasses. But Victor saw her, and to him, she wasn't invisible at all. She was a target. As she leaned forward to set down a crystal glass in front of him, Victor smirked. His companions leaned closer, hungry for another show. "Careful with that, sweetheart," he said in English, his tone dripping with false charm. Then, with his head slightly turned, he switched to Arabic. "She moves well for someone who's only here to clean our tables." The men around him chuckled. They thought it was safe. Amani surely wouldn't understand. She was, in their eyes, just a waitress, but what Victor didn't know was that Amani had grown up in a diplomat's household. She had spent her childhood between Cairo, Rabat, and Washington. Arabic was as natural to her as English, and every word he said sliced through her like a blade. Her face didn't flinch, her hands didn't shake. She placed the glass gently on the linen cloth and moved with perfect composure. But inside, her heart burned, not with shame, but with a decision. She had heard thousands of versions of the same insult before. Normally, she let arrogance roll off like water. But tonight, something in her shifted. Victor leaned back in his chair, basking in the laughter he'd sparked. He thought the game was his. He thought the waitress was too small to fight back. But the look in her eyes, steady, unflinching, was the first crack in his illusion of power. Amani remembered her father's words. "People will underestimate you. Don't waste your voice proving them wrong every time. But when the right moment comes, when it matters, speak and make the world listen." The moment had come. The dining hall had no idea that it was about to witness a scene they would never forget. A billionaire's arrogance was about to collide with a waitress's quiet strength, and in that collision, respect and justice would take center stage. The laughter at Victor's table still lingered in the air, shallow and obedient. Some of his companions looked uneasy, but no one dared challenge him. That was the power he carried, the power to make cruelty sound like entertainment. Amani adjusted the tray in her hand, her face calm, her body language steady. But inside, she felt the weight of a choice pressing against her chest. For years, she had endured comments like this, whispered insults, dismissive tones, the assumption that her skin, her uniform, and her job defined her worth. Normally, she walked away. Tonight, something was different. She set the last plate on the table with deliberate care, then straightened slowly. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting the silence stretch long enough for Victor to smirk again. Then, in flawless Arabic, her voice cut through the laughter. "It is better to be the one serving with dignity than the one speaking without respect." The table froze, glasses stopped mid-air, eyes widened. The sound of forks scraping against porcelain from another table filled the silence that had suddenly dropped over Victor's entourage. They had expected her to blush, to hurry away, to remain small. Instead, she had answered, fluently, confidently, and without breaking her calm. Victor's grin faltered. He hadn't expected this. His companions looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. The balance of power at the table shifted in a single heartbeat. Amani didn't linger on their reaction. She adjusted her apron, met Victor's eyes for only a second longer, and then stepped back, preparing to leave. It wasn't arrogance in her tone. It wasn't anger. It was something more dangerous to a man like Victor. It was dignity. One of the women at the table leaned closer to Victor, whispering, "She speaks Arabic?" But her voice was loud enough for half the table to hear. Another man, uttered fluent. Their surprise was almost louder than Amani's words had been. Victor cleared his throat, trying to recover the moment. "Cute," he said sharply in English, dismissing her like he was brushing dust from his sleeve. But the crack in his confidence was visible. For the first time that night, he wasn't the one controlling the room. As Amani walked away, her steps steady, she could feel eyes following her, not with dismissal anymore, but with curiosity, with something almost like respect. In their silence, she had already won the first battle. But this was only the beginning. Victor Callahan was not a man who allowed himself to be challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. His pride burned hotter than his wealth, and pride, wounded in public, can be far more dangerous than arrogance spoken in private. The night was far from over. Victor Callahan was not a man used to losing control. His empire had been built on confidence, intimidation, and the ability to dominate every room he entered. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Yet here he was, sitting in one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York, feeling the sting of a waitress's words echoing in his ears. For a moment he had been stunned. Her Arabic had been perfect, fluent, sharp, elegant. It wasn't the clumsy imitation of someone who had memorized a phrase. It was the natural rhythm of someone who belonged to the language. And worse, her words had carried a wisdom that sliced through his mockery like a blade. Victor tried to laugh it off, swirling his wineglass again as though nothing had happened. "These servers," he said in English, forcing a smirk, "sometimes they learn a trick or two, makes them think they're special." His table laughed politely, but the sound was thin, hesitant. They had all heard the conviction in Amani's voice. They couldn't unhear it. Anger burned in Victor's chest. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was threatened. His reputation was built on always being the cleverest, always the one holding the last word. He couldn't allow a woman in an apron to outshine him in front of his allies. His empire wasn't just in boardrooms and contracts, it was in perception, and perception, he knew, was everything. So when Amani returned to the table to refill their glasses, Victor leaned back with a predator's grin. This time his words were measured, meant to reestablish his power. "Tell me," he said in English, his voice booming enough for nearby tables to hear, "a woman like you, working here, serving people like us, how does it feel knowing you'll never sit at this table as an equal?" The cruelty in his tone was unmistakable. He wanted to remind her of her place. He wanted to make her small again, to erase the ripple of dignity she had created. The others at the table shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sharp edge of his pride. Some avoided looking at her, others leaned forward, eager to see if she would fold. But Amani didn't flinch. She looked directly at him, her eyes calm, steady, unreadable. For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then she answered, not loudly, not arrogantly, but with a quiet certainty that was even more powerful. "I don't need to sit at your table, Mr. Callahan. One day you may find yourself asking for a seat at mine." The silence that followed was electric. Every word landed like a challenge, but also like a promise. There was no anger in her voice, only truth. Victor's smirk faltered again. His jaw tightened. He wanted to lash out, but something in her tone unsettled him. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't arrogance, it was conviction, the kind of conviction he had only ever heard from people who truly knew who they were. Around the table, whispers began. One man muttered, "Did you hear what she just said?" Another woman leaned back, her eyes narrowing on Amani with new interest. The room had shifted again, and this time Victor wasn't in control. For the first time in years, he felt the eyes of others judging him, not admiring him. And worse, he felt the first twinge of doubt. This wasn't over. For Victor Callahan, it was only the beginning of a battle he never expected to fight. Victor Callahan had built his fortune on the belief that everyone had a price. Employees, partners, even rivals. If you pressed hard enough, their confidence cracked, their loyalty faltered. But as he watched the black waitress walk away with her head high and her words still echoing in the air, he felt something he rarely experienced. Doubt. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to smile for his companions, but inside his pride roared. How dare she? In his world, servers did not challenge billionaires. They blended into the background, silent, invisible. Yet this woman had answered him twice, and each time her words had left him feeling smaller. Leaning toward Richard Hanley, one of his closest allies, Victor muttered under his breath, "Find out who she is, tonight." Richard raised a brow. "She's just a waitress." Victor's glare was sharp. "No one makes me look like a fool in public. No one." Meanwhile, across the restaurant, Amani steadied her breath as she stepped into the kitchen. She wasn't shaken, not in the way Victor expected. She had learned long ago that the world was full of men who mistook arrogance for strength. But she also knew one thing: dignity was louder than pride, and truth carried further than cruelty. Still, she braced herself. Victor wasn't the type to let go of a wound. Back at the table, Victor tried to reclaim his charm, launching into another story about global deals and late-night negotiations. But the mood had shifted. His audience wasn't hanging on every word anymore. Some nodded politely, but others glanced toward the door where Amani had vanished, their minds still replaying her bold replies. The more Victor spoke, the more he felt it, the loss of control, and it infuriated him. When Amani returned to clear plates, Victor decided to push harder. "Tell us, miss," he said, pausing as though daring her to fill in the silence. "What? Is your name again?" "Brooks," she replied simply, her tone professional. "Miss Brooks," he repeated, his smile razor-sharp. "Tell us, do you believe hard work alone can change a person's life? Or do you think luck plays a bigger role? Because from where I sit, it seems luck hasn't been very kind to you." The table stirred. Some guests lowered their eyes, sensing the cruelty behind his words. He wanted her humiliated, silenced. But Amani only placed another glass down and answered evenly, her voice calm, yet carrying weight. "Luck opens a door, Mr. Callahan, but it is wisdom that keeps it open, and respect that decides who is welcome inside." Her words weren't just a reply, they were a lesson, one so sharp that even those seated beside Victor shifted uncomfortably. A woman across the table gave a small nod, almost in agreement. Victor's hand tightened around his wine glass. He hated it, the way she kept turning his arrogance into moments of truth. He wasn't used to being the one people whispered about, the one others doubted. Yet tonight he felt it clearly. The tide was shifting. As Amani walked away again, a businessman leaned closer to Victor and whispered, "She's impressive." Victor's eyes darkened. "She's a waitress, nothing more." But deep inside, for the first time in years, Victor Callahan felt the sting of fear, not of losing money or power, but of losing the image he had spent a lifetime crafting. And the more she spoke, the more that image cracked. The night was turning into something he couldn't control. Victor Callahan was a man who thrived on dominance, but tonight he felt cornered. Every attempt to humiliate the waitress had only sharpened her presence. Her replies had not been angry or loud. They had been calm, precise, impossible to dismiss. And worse, the people at his table had noticed. Some were no longer laughing at his remarks. Some even looked impressed by her. That, to Victor, was unforgivable. He leaned back, his mind calculating. If words could not silence her, then exposure would. He believed everyone had a weakness, a hidden truth that could pull them back down. When Amani returned to collect the next round of plates, Victor's voice carried across the table again. "Tell me, Miss Brooks," he said, his tone thick with mockery, "how does a woman like you learn perfect Arabic? A lucky phrase from a textbook? Or did you just rehearse a few lines to impress us?" The jab was obvious. He wanted to turn her fluency into a trick, a performance, something smaller than it was. The table waited for her reply. But Amani didn't flinch. She set down her tray, folded her hands in front of her apron, and spoke with quiet strength. "My father was a diplomat. I grew up in Cairo and Rabat. Arabic isn't a trick, it's part of my life." Her words landed with the weight of truth. For the first time that night, Victor felt his certainty collapse. A diplomat's daughter? He hadn't expected that. Around the table, surprise flickered across faces. Suddenly, she wasn't just a waitress in their eyes. She was someone with a story, someone who had seen more of the world than most of them combined. Victor tried to laugh it off. "So you're telling us you've dined with kings and queens, yet here you are serving drinks?" This time, Amani's answer was sharper but still dignified. "There is no shame in honest work, Mr. Callahan. What shames a person is forgetting that respect belongs, yes, to everyone, not just the wealthy. A murmur spread across the table. Someone even clapped softly before catching themselves. The balance of the room had shifted again, and this time it was undeniable. Victor's face tightened. He felt the sting of defeat in every whispered comment, in every glance that no longer looked at him with admiration but with judgment. He wanted to shout, to remind them who he was, what he had built, how much he was worth. But the more he tried to assert himself, the smaller he felt. Amani, meanwhile, simply lifted the tray again and continued her work. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. She had spoken truth, and truth had carried further than arrogance ever could. For the first time in years, Victor Callahan, the billionaire who had humiliated rivals and silenced competitors, felt powerless. And the worst part? It wasn't because of a rival CEO or a corporate scandal. It was because of a waitress who refused to be diminished. The restaurant buzzed with new energy. Whispers floated from other tables. People had seen what happened, and the story was already spreading beyond his circle. By tomorrow, he realized, it would no longer be his version of the night that people remembered. It would be hers. And that terrified him. The night at Cipriani's had begun with laughter at Victor Callahan's table, but now the air was different. The room seemed to breathe with quiet tension. Waiters whispered in corners, diners exchanged glances, and every eye seemed to drift toward the man who once commanded attention without effort. Victor's face was tight with forced composure. He could feel his grip on the room slipping, his power draining not through a failed deal or a scandal, but through the simple, steady dignity of a black waitress he had mocked. His pride screamed for revenge, but his instincts told him he was already losing. Then the moment of instant karma arrived. As Amani moved gracefully through the restaurant, the maitre d' appeared at her side, speaking softly. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, she re-emerged, not with a tray this time, but with a man in a tailored gray suit following her. The suit was sharp but understated, the kind worn by someone important who didn't need to flaunt it. The whispers spread fast. "Isn't that the chairman of the International Trade Council?" someone murmured. Another guest leaned closer. "He's one of the keynote speakers for the Global Business Summit tomorrow." The man walked directly to Victor's table, greeting Amani first with a warm handshake and words in Arabic. She replied fluently, her smile calm, her confidence unshaken. Then he turned to Victor. "Callahan," he said, his tone polite but distant. "I was told you'd be here tonight. I planned to introduce myself at the summit tomorrow, but I couldn't resist when I heard a familiar voice." He gestured toward Amani. "Miss Brooks is one of my former interns. Brilliant, multilingual, and deeply respected in our circle." The table went silent. Every head turned toward Victor. The billionaire who had mocked her for being just a waitress was suddenly confronted with the truth. The woman he tried to humiliate was not beneath him at all. She was connected, educated, and valued by the very world he claimed to dominate. Victor forced a laugh, trying to recover. "Ah, of course, small world." But no one laughed with him. His companions' expressions had shifted, from admiration to discomfort, even pity. They had seen him fall, and they weren't eager to share in his embarrassment. Amani simply nodded, her face calm. "Thank you, sir," she said to the man. Then she turned to Victor, her voice soft but firm. "Respect isn't something money can buy, Mr. Callahan. It's something you either give or lose." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Victor opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in years, he had been stripped of his armor, not by a rival CEO, not by a hostile takeover, but by the truth spoken from someone he thought powerless. When Amani walked away, the room seemed to follow her with their eyes. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was unforgettable. Victor sat in silence, his glass of wine untouched, his laughter gone. The billionaire had entered the night as the center of attention. He left it as the man everyone whispered about, for all the wrong reasons. And as the doors of Cipriani's closed behind Amani at the end of her shift, the moral was clear. Never underestimate, never mock, never judge. Respect is the only true wealth.